Greetings to all those in New York attending the important workshop on the theme of articulation of the voice of the voiceless. I'm speaking here from Scotland in the UK. It's Dr. Thomas Daffern. I've met some people who will be there, and others have not yet had the opportunity of meeting in person, but perhaps you've heard of the work of my institute. We've been going since 1991, specialising in the study of peace in relation to global philosophy, comparative religion, comparative global philosophy. And we're one of the few institutes in the world that have this intersection between academic, scientific research into the nature of peace and conflict resolution and comparative global philosophy, which means the comparative study of all world religious and philosophical traditions, including both all the different spiritual teachings of mankind, but also all the secular and scientific traditions. So I'm speaking as director of that and also as coordinator of International Philosophers of Peace globally. And having recently come back from a conference in India hosted by the Sri Ramanuja Mission Trust in Chennai, in Hyderabad and in Bangalore at the Grand Global Peace Meet, where I had the good fortune to meet up with several of the people who'll be there today. And it's as a result of that I'm addressing your important meeting. The subtext is, to quote, "the anguished appeal by the innocent victims of violence for the cessation of all hostilities happening in the name of religion across the continents, and the potential key role of NGOs and the media in mitigating these agonies." So this is an important theme very dear to my heart, which I've been working on as an academic and a spiritual practitioner and a teacher for about 30 years, based in the UK but travelling to over 30 countries. I've spoken twice at the UN headquarters in New York, and what I'm about to say, therefore, is based on over 30 years of solid research and practice. Now, inspired by all these years of interfaith peace work, I also spent nearly 10 years as Secretary General of the World Conference on Religion and Peace, which is based there in New York City as the main interfaith peace organisation in the world. I was Secretary General for the UK and Europe for nearly 10 years, and also served on the European Council for that, attending many meetings, including in the Vatican in '94 under the former Pope John Paul, and met many senior interfaith leaders over the years from all the faith traditions: Buddhist, Hindu, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Baha'i, Zoroastrian, Islamic, Jewish, Christian, etc., etc., and also indigenous and pagan religious leaders from all cultures, including the Druid pagan community in the UK and Ireland, and also in the Americas, where I was born, actually, in Montreal. So, anyway, as a result of all this, what I've come up with is the text of an Interfaith Peace Treaty, and it's that I want to present to the meeting today. This is a treaty that's been drawn up after much consideration, which comprises 56 clauses. And it comes about as a result of the following reflections. Wars are ended by peace treaties, and the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East, which we're seeing above all in Syria and Iraq, but in Yemen and Afghanistan, which the world has been engaged in ever since 9/11 and before. Today actually is the anniversary, the day on which I'm recording this, of the death of T. Lawrence, so-called Lawrence of Arabia, who died in Dorset, where I used to teach at Paul Grammar School. And his arising of the Arab tribes during World War I certainly led to a short-term military victory over the Ottoman Empire by the Allies, but it led to the long-term destabilisation of the Middle East. And I think T. Lawrence realised before he died just what a genie he'd let out of the bottle. The Wahhabi tradition of the desert tribes that he'd stirred up was a somewhat backward theological perspective in comparison to the more sophisticated Ottoman Turkish spirituality associated with the Bektashi and the Sufi traditions of Rumi and so on. And unfortunately, in recent decades, we've seen the effects of this very stern and puritanical and intellectually limited Wahhabi doctrine as it spread its geopolitical might around the planet. And this is really what we're seeing in the rise of ISIL. It's a Wahhabi movement inspired by the very stern doctrines of that tradition, which run counter-thetical to the entire Enlightenment traditions of European philosophy and Jeffersonian philosophy, the principles on which the Republic of the US was founded during the Enlightenment 18th century. Again, based on tolerance of faiths, tolerance of different religions, is completely turned on its head in the 18th century, very narrow-minded thinking of Ibn Wahhab, who was not an extremely well-educated man, to put it mildly. In Islamic terms, he'd never studied comparative philosophy, he'd never studied other traditions, he'd never seen the wisdom behind aspects of Shi'ism, he'd never studied the wisdom behind the great Sufi traditions or the Islamic philosophical traditions, which were studied in Istanbul, which were studied in Baghdad, which were studied in the great schools of Cairo, and which formed the literate wisdom traditions of the Middle East in the Islamic context, and which had taken over 1,000 years of profound thinking by Muslim scholars to arrive at. What Ibn Wahhab was trying to do was to turn those all on their heads and say, well, we're going to go back to 6th century, 7th century Arabia, and anything that's come since then is apostasy, and we will root it out. We will tear up the tombs, we will destroy the traces of non-Islamic faith, and so on and so on. Now, unfortunately, such a backward-looking kind of sect, which from an Islamic authentic perspective is actually a heresy, then became a dominant geopolitical force in the Middle East and has continued unstopped. Now, how was this allowed to happen? How did the West, how did intellectual elites around the world who care for humanity and for peace actually permit this thing to arise? It's a complex question, and there isn't time in this short talk to actually explain that. But it has to do with the development of secularism in Western society, and this notion that religion is something that we don't talk about, that one has one's private faith, and then in the geopolitical sphere one deals with economics, business interests, national interests, and so on. So in the USA in particular, with the divorcing of spirituality from the affairs of state, the notion arose that one leaves out all discussion of religious and moral values and simply advances the naked geopolitical interests of the USA, as they're deemed to be by the given military political intelligence elite of whichever president's running the country. I think in Britain we have a different tradition. I'm speaking from that tradition here, which is under Gladstone we realised that foreign policy actually has to be bound together with ethics. It wasn't just Gladstone, Disraeli as well. The great Victorian statesman realised that you can't run an empire, which the British did for a couple of hundred years successfully, unless you actually, in a sense, have some kind of spiritual mandate or vision ethically of what you're going to be doing. It was very interesting going around in Calcutta recently, in the Victoria Palace, which is a shrine built by Lord Curzon to Queen Victoria. And the quotes of hers that are on the wall, if you have the fortune to be in Calcutta, go to it, in which she took her role as the visionary monarch behind the British Empire at its apogee extremely seriously, and she dedicated her life to a world community of peace and equality and justice and freedom. Now, if you don't have some kind of vision, some kind of ethical foundation, then, as the Bible says, the people will perish. So, the idea that you can disassociate all ethical and moral concerns from geopolitical concerns is, I think, the first reason that we've got into this tragic mess. There's a vacuum opened up in which politicians are completely unable to deal with the threats of what is a very simplistic ideology. ISIL, as an extension of let's say, the very basic of Wahhabi doctrine, in its most naked and rude form, appeals to young people, including people in Britain and elsewhere around the world, because it is so simplistic. Education systems nowadays are not really addressing the need for an advanced and sophisticated religious education. Schools cater at a very low level to giving a basic smattering of religious knowledge. And in many cases, in many schools, in the USA for example, they are entirely secular. They don't actually give any knowledge of religions. I've worked in the UK school system as a religious studies teacher for 10 years and developed a very sophisticated educational pedagogical tool called the Periodic Table of the World's Religious and Philosophical Traditions, which is available on a website and in poster form and can be used in schools. And I strongly recommend that every school in USA and other countries should have a copy of this table. In my opinion, it should become as well known as Mendeleev's Periodic Table of the Elements. The table is grouped in categories of faith traditions, such as Christianity's primal religions, the Chinese religions, the Buddhist traditions, the different forms of Judaism, different forms of Shintoism, Sikhism, Islam, new religious movements, Persian-inspired. Also includes esoteric traditions like anthroposophy and alchemy and theosophy and Freemasonry and so on. And then it includes also the philosophical traditions, lineages such as Kantianism, idealism, Aristotelianism, Platonism, Pythagoreanism, logical positivism and so on. So it's a very, very comprehensive map which covers all the different philosophical and religious traditions of mankind. Now, in my view, an intellectually mature school child in the sixth form, 17 or 18-year-old, can easily comprehend this table and can master the contents of a lot of it with a bit of work. Now, of course, our schools don't teach religious literacy, and it's a very strange situation because we expect, say, a chemistry student or a physics student doing an A-level in school by the age of 18 to have mastered the periodic table, to understand its structure, to understand how the different elements are formed, how the different electrons and protons and neutrons and so on coalesce into different chemical forms, and that in turn inspires the entire study of material science, how biology works, how the cell works, how energy is transformed and fed around the ecosphere and the human body and so on. Unless you've mastered that, you can't make sense of the findings of modern science. Well, I would argue that we need to master the periodic table of the world's philosophical and religious traditions in exactly the same way, in order to understand the noosphere, what Chardin called the noosphere, the way that all the different religious systems on the planet have intercooperated, intercoordinated, how they've had some kind of rivality and at the same time strange cooperation going on. Like in all evolutionary processes, there's love and strife at work, as Empedocles said. They take from each other, they borrow ideas. So, for example, early Christianity borrowed from Zoroastrianism, and indirectly, and then directly from Judaism, the idea of the Messiah, the Seishant. It's a Zoroastrian concept, which is a prophecy that Zoroaster made, the founder of the Zoroastrian Persian tradition. And then it came into Judaism, it came into Christianity. In turn, that came into Islam, which inspired the idea of the revelation, the prophetic revelation that brings redemption, that brings mankind back to peace. And that then in turn inspired ideals in Shia Islam, the hidden Imam, the one that would return, the Mahdi, and so on. It was also inspiring to some extent in the Buddhist teachings of Maitreya, the coming Buddha, who again would come and save the world from violence and bloodshed. So that's just one small example of how ideas are transmuted across different religious boundaries. They're far more porous than people realised. It's the same, for example, with the alphabet, with the writing systems we use, coming from Phoenician, then going into Canaanite, into Hebrew, into Aramaic, into ancient Greek, into Latin. And in the other direction, going into ancient Persian writing and Sanskrit and so on. What I would argue is there are certain alphabetic codes that come up again in each different religious and spiritual system on the planet, and that the duty of the scholar is to unpick these, to find the common threads. Now, if you do that, you will see that there is absolutely no reason why these religions, or any of them, should be fighting each other. And as a scholar, trying to contribute to, let's say, this complete mayhem that's going on, not just in the Middle East, but we're seeing it in many parts of the world, where religions are becoming part of the problem rather than part of the solution. In my own work as a scholar of religions, I've done a detailed commentary on the surahs in the Quran, verb by verb, word by word, using the Arabic, and also the New Testament and the Hebrew scriptures. And I can report that there's no reason why Jews, Christians and Muslims should be fighting each other. They should actually already have been in a situation of peace with each other. And I think the job of philosophers is to find a common ground for these traditions to live in harmony. Now, this is the thinking, therefore, behind the Interfaith Peace Treaty, because wars end when people actually sign a treaty. That's how diplomacy was invented. The Treaty of Westphalia ended the tragic 30 Years' War in European history, which raged in the 17th century between Protestants and Catholics, and it looked like Europe would go on fighting till the end of the world, just like the Shias and Sunnis seem to be doing in the Middle East. In a sense, they're having their 30 Years' War now. Eventually, in 1648, it was decided by European statesmen of grandeur that this was a pointless and stupid exercise. And because of the work of philosophers such as Leibniz and Descartes and Lord Bacon and others, who ushered in this notion of the Enlightenment, it was realised that it's less important whether you're a Catholic or a Protestant. What matters is your own personal morality and your intellectual attainment. What matters is your calibration on the scale of enlightenment, both personally and then in terms of your social outreach. And that's the way to get peace, not what label you go under or what flag you fly on your ship. So the Treaty of Westphalia ended the 30 Years' War in Europe, and everybody breathed an enormous sigh of relief. But and that was really the beginning of European diplomacy in terms of international recognition of boundaries and the laws of war and so on. What we have to do, therefore, at the moment, in this chaos, maelstrom of interreligious feuding, particularly in the Middle East, but it's also going on in the streets of London, the streets of Birmingham, the streets of New York and Los Angeles. It's going on in Baghdad and Damascus and Cairo. Everywhere there are groups of armed men, usually, but backed up by their womenfolk, who are representing this or that religious faction. And they see themselves as opposed to this or that other one, and then engaging in all kinds of either overt conflict, violence, or cyber warfare, cyber attack, and so on. Now, politics, as usual, cannot deal with this situation. Politicians haven't got a clue, A, what's going on, because they think purely in secular, or at the best, mono-religious terms. They haven't got the place of intellectual sophistication you need to deal with the actual reality of the world as it is nowadays, which is a very complex, interdimensional and interconnected world in which different philosophies and ideologies are now coexisting for the first time in the history of the planet because of the intellectual dimensions of globalization. This has never happened before. I can address you at a meeting in New York and yet record this in a castle in Scotland a few days beforehand. This is unprecedented in world history. So we can't look to the political leaders to actually solve this one. All they know how to do is fight wars. The American president is the commander-in-chief. The British Prime Minister has his finger on the button and is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. The same with all the other nation-states on the planet. They can go to war. They have incredibly sophisticated weapons at their disposal, including weapons of mass destruction. Off the castle here at Loch Goyle is Britain's nuclear-armed submarine fleet, Trident submarine. which has enough firepower to destroy a large part of the world within a few minutes, as does the similar systems of Russia and the US and China and so on. But what we're lacking, what the politicians can't do, is find how to bring peace. They're lacking an effective peace policy. And I've set up here in the castle the Centre for Peace Policy Research because of this lacuna. We have defence policy, we have foreign policy, we have diplomatic policy research institutes all over the planet, but we actually have no peace policy research institutes. This is the first on the planet, which seems to me a ridiculous state of affairs, and I hope they'll mushroom and develop much more broadly. If we want peace, we have to prepare for peace and think it through. So, as a preamble to a much bigger approach towards a wider peace policy, which obviously involves economic security and environmental stability and many other dimensions, peace is a complex state of well-being that we humans actually strive for and wish for, which involves love, the satisfaction of our emotional, our physical, our intellectual and our spiritual needs. As a preamble to that, what I'm proposing is the interfaith leaders and the intellectual leaders of the planet should sign up to the Interfaith Peace Treaty, which is a declaration of peace. It's saying, look, I follow a particular path, whatever, Jain, Buddhist, Druid, Hindu, Christian, whichever one of the 168 on the periodic table. But I'm not personally going to attack your followers or you. I'm going to instead submit our respective truth claims to scholarship and reason and philosophical analysis and scientific method. You claim that X, I may claim that Y. Well, let's submit this to the court of reason rather than the Kalashnikovs on the street. What I'm proposing, therefore, is a kind of global enlightenment, as happened at the time of the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, when the great thinkers of the day realised that the complex theological disputes between Protestants and Catholics can't be solved on the battlefields. All that will do will lead to more mass killing and mass suffering. So let's sign this Interfaith Peace Treaty. Now, of course, the politicians won't sign it and can't sign it and haven't got a clue why it should be signed or why it should come into being. The secular political leaders of the planet and their spokespeople in the United Nations and the European Union and other such agencies, by definition, marginalise the importance of religion. They're not able to comprehend its significance, and if it's pointed out to them, then their response is simply instability, insecurity, and violence. What they don't see is the potential of religion and spirituality for peacemaking. And perhaps it's not surprising, given the role that religion has played in recent decades in destabilisation and conflict stimulation. So I think the Interfaith Peace Treaty is a kind of declaration of faith by the world's religious and philosophical and intellectual leaders. It's a way of saying that we, the intellectual, moral and spiritual authorities of our respective traditions, are available. We affirm and swear in solemn oaths and affirmations that we hereby declare a lasting and inviolable interfaith peace treaty between our respective traditions. And then the text, which is available on the website, or it's available in hard copy or by PDF, then goes on that we, the followers of various religious and philosophical traditions, hereby declare a lasting peace treaty between our respective faith perspectives. Whereas the world is suffering from interreligious wars, including civil wars, whereas for centuries mankind's social and intellectual and emotional life has been rendered insecure by wars and the constant threat of wars, which have often had a dimension of religious difference involved, whereas mankind still suffers from the grave threat of nuclear war and omnicide, either deliberately launched or accidentally caused, whereas as long as representatives of our respective faith traditions remain in violent conflict, we are not able as one humanity to devote the energy, wealth and ingenuity we require to solve the other global problems facing the planet. quote, brackets, poverty, unemployment, social development, equality, social justice, environmental conservation, sustainable development, etc. Therefore, we are resolved as responsible and visionary intellectual and spiritual leaders of the various faith traditions of mankind that we shall utter, affirm, declare and swear this permanent Interfaith Peace Treaty. And in so doing, we appeal to all the other responsible and enlightened leaders and followers of all the faith traditions of mankind to subscribe their signatures and oaths to this sacred text, and to follow it henceforth, now and forever. We therefore swear, affirm, declare and resolve henceforth. Now that's the preamble. And then there follow the 56 clauses which deal with the minutiae of interfaith scholarship and peace scholarship, and the intellectual challenges it makes on our respective faith paradigms that we should declare such a peace treaty. As I say, this is based on over 30 years' research. It's also based on a very complex PhD thesis that took me over 20 years, actually, from conception to completion at the University of London. And again, it's a public document available for reading, and it proposes the notion of transpersonal history, which complements and runs parallel to conventional diplomatic, political, economic and social history, but addresses the noetic dimensions of human nature, the spiritual aspirations, the emotional longings, and indeed the religious and mystical experiences of mankind, which Jung, Assagioli, Maslow and other great psychologists have pointed out are a scientific fact of our human nature. And to leave them out of the picture of the human story would be like to try and paint the sky without using the colour blue, something that even Turner wouldn't have attempted. So that's my contribution to this important conference in New York. I wish to lodge in your attention the existence of the Interfaith Peace Treaty as a declaration of faith in humanity and faith in a rational spirituality. I've been around the planet enough, travelling and teaching in over 30 countries and meeting religious leaders, philosophers, heads of different religious orders and groups, to know that there is a consensus on the need to balance our spiritual aspirations with rationality and spirituality with science, and that this can indeed be done. The treaty is, in a sense, a blueprint, a map showing how it can be done. And my vision is that if 1 million people can sign up to this treaty, 1 million heads of different religious groups and orders and lineages and all the different spiritual paths and faiths that there are on the planet, including the indigenous traditions, the North American Indian tribes, and all the respective elders of the most ancient and primal peoples of the planet, as well as the custodians of the revealed religions, the Zoroastrianisms, the Islams, the Judaisms, the Christianities and the Baha'isms and so on. If all their respective groups and factions can declare this treaty, it's not a concession. It's not saying, well, we admit we're wrong, they're right. It's simply a modus vivendi whereby we agree to sublimate our disagreements into non-violent discourse and philosophical and intellectual dialectic instead of vicious, inhumane bloodletting, which then enables nobody to actually succeed and religion itself to suffer from all the bad name after effects that brings. So I hope that people that have come to this very important meeting in New York will look up the Interfaith Peace Treaty. If there aren't copies there in the meeting, it's available on a website. If you just look at interfaithpeacetreaty.wordpress.com, it comes up. And you can also email me direct, Dr. Thomas Clough Daffern, thomasdaffern@gmail.com, and I can send you a PDF of the treaty. Read through it, hopefully sign it, and encourage as many spiritual visionaries and philosophers and intellectuals that you can come across, whether they're on the religious end of the spectrum or the scientific end of the spectrum, to sign and declare and affirm this treaty. Among many other things, it's a declaration of peace between the religious intellectuals and the scientific intellectuals on the planet, which I think is itself a very needed part of the overall jigsaw of peacemaking. So, time is short. I can't go into the full ramifications of details on this, but those that are interested can consult the website, which is www.educationaid.net. And I'm very pleased to say that Swami Chaturvedi, the inspiration behind the Sri Ramanuja Memorial Trust, and who I met in Bangalore and Hyderabad, and we had many interesting discussions and heard each other's talks at the Grand Global Peace Meet, I think are in one accord that this is something of a breakthrough, this Interfaith Peace Treaty, as a tool or an instrument, if it can be disseminated and signed up to by the different spiritual elders of the planet, can hold out a hope for mankind that common sense and reason and wisdom can prevail. It was also wonderful to meet up again with Professor Chumakov from the Russian Philosophical Association, who was also in Hyderabad and who also signed the treaty on behalf of the Russian Philosophical Association of 3,000 of the most important philosophers in Russia. Again, a nation that wishes for peace often has a bad press, but actually has an incredibly alive and vibrant intellectual tradition, just as as India does, and really understands through the costs of war, having experienced invasion in World War II and the tremendous sufferings that caused, that really doesn't want to see World War III break out. And again, another reason we ought to be signing the Interfaith Peace Treaty is because of the tragedy in Ukraine, on the borders of Europe. Again, my vision is that if we can get the religious faith intellectual leaders of all parts of Ukraine that are involved in this tragic civil war to affirm this treaty, then we can build, shall we say, pockets of intellectual resistance to the notion that the norm of civilized behaviour is to throw bombs and shells at your so-called enemy. What we have to learn to do is what Christ said, which is learn to walk on the water, which is a metaphor for emotionalism, hysteria. We have to learn to walk on the water of chaos and actually bring peace into these troubled regions of the world. Affirming the Interfaith Peace Treaty is not the end of that process, it's just the beginning. It's saying, I want to be part of that team. I'm doing the walk. Let's go. Okay, so thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day there in New York, and that the sun shines on all your endeavours, and that together we can restore common sense and wisdom and vision to this planet. Thank you.